here is a question that should unsettle you. How does a man abuse over 300 people, for decades, inside clinical rooms with parents sitting just a few feet away, and no one stops him? Not because no one was watching, because everyone was watching, and he made sure they saw exactly what he wanted them to see. Pause and consider that. A physician, a trusted authority figure, a man described by colleagues as warm, generous, tireless, the kind of man you wanted treating your child. And that trust, that carefully constructed image, was not a side effect of his life. It was the weapon. Today, we are not here to recount his crimes. We are here to dissect the psychological architecture of the man who committed them. Because understanding how someone like Larry Nassar operates is not morbid curiosity. It is survival knowledge. The facts, briefly. Larry Nassar served as the national team physician for USA Gymnastics and as a sports medicine doctor at Michigan State University for over 2 decades. During that time, he sexually abused an estimated 300 or more athletes, many of them minors, under the guise of performing legitimate medical procedures. He was sentenced in 2018. Federal, 60 years. State, 40 to 175 years, consecutive. He will not be eligible for release before January 30th, 2068, when he would be 104 years old. Judge Rosemary Aquilina looked him in the eye at sentencing and said, plainly, that she had signed his death warrant. But the how, the psychological mechanics that allowed this to happen for so long, that is what we analyze today. We will examine 3 core psychological pillars: malignant narcissism, predatory masking, and the clinical weaponization of trust. Each one, by itself, is dangerous. Together, they created one of the most prolific abusers in American sports history. Malignant narcissism. Standard narcissism is characterized by an inflated sense of self, a craving for admiration, and a reduced capacity for empathy. Malignant narcissism takes that profile and fuses it with antisocial traits. A willingness to harm others when it serves the self, without guilt, without remorse. Now, here is where Nassar's case becomes clinically extraordinary. At sentencing, over 150 survivors delivered victim impact statements. It was one of the longest sentencing hearings in American legal history. And during that process, Nassar wrote a letter to the judge. He did not use that letter to express genuine accountability. He used it to complain about the process. He wrote that the hearing had become, and I am paraphrasing, a forum for people to vent, and that it was causing him mental torture. Pause and consider that. Over 150 human beings stood before a court and described the lifelong damage inflicted upon them as children. And his documented, written response was that he was the one suffering. That is not a man experiencing guilt. That is a man whose psychological orientation is so profoundly self-centered that even in the moment of maximum accountability, he reframes himself as the victim. This is textbook malignant narcissism. The grandiosity doesn't collapse under consequence. It simply redirects. And this trait, this inability to genuinely perceive others as having interior lives equal to his own, is precisely what allowed him to continue for so long. His victims' pain was not real to him in any morally operative sense. They existed in relation to him. Their discomfort was an inconvenience. Their trauma was noise. Have you ever encountered someone who, when confronted with how they hurt you, somehow made themselves the injured party? That reflex, in its clinical extreme, is what you are looking at here. Predatory masking. This is perhaps the most dangerous trait in Nassar's psychological profile, and the most instructive for understanding how predators operate in plain sight. Predatory masking is not simply lying. Anyone can lie. Predatory masking is the sustained, deliberate construction of a persona, a public identity so consistent, so credentialed, and so socially reinforced that it functions as structural camouflage. Nassar spent decades cultivating his mask. He was the doctor who stayed late, who remembered every athlete's name, who brought candy to the training facility, who went above and beyond, who the parents loved. Former athletes have described him as almost supernaturally attentive. He remembered birthdays. He gave gifts. He created emotional dependency long before any abuse occurred. a process known in forensic psychology as grooming, and Nassar executed it at an institutional scale. He didn't just groom individual victims. He groomed organizations. He groomed parents. He groomed the entire professional ecosystem around him so thoroughly that when victims did come forward, and some came forward as early as the 1990s, the institution's first impulse was to protect the man, not the children. Pause and consider what that means. It means his mask was not just believed by individuals. It was structurally enforced by the institutions that had invested in his credibility. This is how predatory masking operates at its most sophisticated. The predator does not simply deceive people. They arrange the social architecture so that disbelieving them comes at a cost. To accuse Nassar was to challenge USA Gymnastics, to challenge Michigan State, to challenge the legacy of a decorated medical career. The mask becomes a fortress. And the cruelest detail? He performed the abuse in rooms where parents were sometimes present, using the authority of medical procedure to render the abuse literally unrecognizable to witnesses. He didn't hide in the shadows. He operated in the light. Because the mask was that good. I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Think about someone in your life, a workplace, a family structure, a social circle, who seemed universally beloved, charismatic, generous with their time, whose reputation felt almost untouchable. Now ask yourself, was that warmth ever conditional? Did it disappear the moment it wasn't useful? Predatory masking doesn't always look like a monster. It looks like the most helpful person in the room. That is the red flag. Genuine warmth is consistent regardless of audience. Performed warmth has tells. It concentrates around people with power, disappears around those with none, and escalates when the performer needs something. Keep that in mind as we move to the third and most psychologically complex pillar, the weaponization of institutional trust. This is where Nassar's psychology moves beyond individual pathology into something that implicates entire systems and demands a forensic examination of how institutions become complicit in abuse without ever intending to be. Nassar did not simply exploit the trust individuals placed in him. He exploited the trust that institutions place in credentials. Here is what that means clinically. When a person holds a position validated by a major university, a national governing body, and an Olympic organization simultaneously, the institutional weight of those affiliations creates a presumption of legitimacy that is extraordinarily difficult for any individual to overcome. When a 16-year-old gymnast told an adult that Dr. Nassar had touched her inappropriately, she was not simply arguing against one man's word. She was arguing against Michigan State University, against USA Gymnastics, against the institutional framework of American Olympic sport. The psychological literature on this dynamic, sometimes called authority compliance bias, shows that humans are neurologically predisposed to defer to credentialed authority, especially in domains where they lack expertise themselves. Medical settings are among the highest compliance environments known to researchers. Nassar understood this, consciously or otherwise. He operated in the precise overlap of maximum authority and minimum patient knowledge. His victims were young athletes who had been conditioned, by gymnastics culture itself, to endure pain without complaint, to trust coaching authority without question, and to believe that the discomfort they felt was part of the process. He did not just find that culture, he selected for it. That is the signature of sophisticated predatory psychology. Not randomness, not opportunism, architectural selection. He built his career inside an environment that had preconditioned his victims to be compliant, preconditioned adults to defer to him, and preconditioned institutions to protect their assets. Pause and consider that level of structural exploitation. The FBI was informed about credible allegations against Nassar in 2015. Abuse continued for over a year before his arrest. The institutional machinery, built on credential, investment, and reputational protection, moved slowly enough that dozens more victims were harmed. This is not an indictment of every individual involved. It is a forensic observation about what happens when trust in a system overrides the testimony of the people that system was supposed to protect. The psychological severance. Prison as reckoning. Now we arrive at the present. And here is where the forensic psychology becomes most instructive. Not because of what Nassar's imprisonment tells us about punishment, but because of what it reveals about the complete inversion of the psychological conditions that enabled him. Everything that protected him is gone. His credentials, meaningless. His institutional affiliations, dissolved. His carefully constructed persona, known. In the general population of a federal penitentiary, there is no authority to exploit, no credential to hide behind, no parent to groom, no institution to absorb the accusation. There is only the raw social hierarchy of people who have committed violence and who hold their own moral codes about what is unforgivable. And within that hierarchy, Larry Nassar occupies the lowest possible position. The July 2023 stabbing at USB Coleman 2, 10 wounds, a collapsed lung, blood on a concrete floor, was not random prison violence. It was the logical endpoint of his psychological profile meeting an environment immune to his only tool. His mask doesn't work here. You cannot groom someone with nothing left to lose. You cannot weaponize institutional trust when the institution is a cell block. The social engineering that protected him for decades is not only useless, it actively marks him. Because the other inmates know exactly what he is, and they have none of the compliance mechanisms he spent his career exploiting. What the psychological literature on long-term high-security imprisonment describes is a kind of forced interior confrontation. Without the external architecture of identity, the title, the credential, the white coat, the self has nowhere to perform for. What remains is what was always there underneath. Whether Nassar has the psychological capacity for genuine reflection, clinical research gives us little reason for optimism. True malignant narcissists rarely develop the empathic infrastructure required for authentic remorse. What they more typically experience is grievance, a persistent sense of injustice about their own situation, uncoupled from any genuine reckoning with the damage they caused. The record suggests that is precisely where he is. This case did something unusual. It didn't just prosecute one man. It forced a public reckoning with a question that most institutions would prefer to avoid. How do we build systems that can be believed over credentials? The sentencing hearing, 156 survivors, 7 days, one of the most extended public testimonials of institutional abuse in American legal history, functioned as something beyond jurisprudence. It was a collective psychological event. For the survivors, it was the first time the architecture of denial had been formally dismantled. The same institutional weight that had protected Nassar for years was now compelled to listen, record, and validate what it had spent years dismissing. For the public watching, it produced what psychologists call a moral coherence crisis, the dissonance of learning that a trusted system had failed on such a massive scale. That discomfort is productive. It is the psychological precondition for structural change. But the forensic lesson, the one that outlasts the headlines, is this. The danger was never just one man. The danger was a specific constellation of psychological traits operating inside a specific institutional architecture that was optimized, accidentally or otherwise, to make him invisible. Remove the credential. Remove the cultural conditioning of his victims. Remove the institutional incentive to protect reputation over people. And he is detectable, stoppable, early. Red flags in everyday life. So, here is what this case teaches us about recognizing these patterns before they become catastrophic. Red flag 1. The person whose warmth is always instrumental. Genuine care is distributed without agenda. Predatory warmth concentrates around the useful and evaporates around the powerless. If someone's generosity consistently tracks with their access to potential victims, children, patients, subordinates, people in vulnerable positions, that pattern deserves scrutiny. Red flag 2. The professional who is uniquely, persistently alone with vulnerable people. Legitimate expertise does not require eliminating witnesses. If someone consistently engineers one-on-one access with the vulnerable and frames oversight as distrust, that framing is the manipulation. Red flag 3. Institutions that treat credibility as a zero-sum resource. When an organization's response to allegations is to immediately protect the accused reputation rather than investigate the allegation, the institution has made a choice about whose welfare matters. That choice has consequences. Red flag 4. The person who, when confronted, makes themselves the victim. Not every person who deflects responsibility is dangerous, but a consistent, reflexive reframing of accountability into personal persecution, especially across multiple incidents, is a hallmark of the narcissistic profile we examine today. And finally, the most important forensic lesson from this case: believe early testimony. The first person to come forward is almost never the first victim. They are the one who finally couldn't stay silent. Which means by the time you hear the first voice, there are others who have been waiting, wondering if anyone will listen. Pause and consider the weight of that. The system that protected Larry Nassar for decades was not built by villains. It was built by ordinary human tendencies: deference to authority, investment in reputation, discomfort with accusation, and the quiet preference for a story that doesn't require us to act. Understanding that is how we build something better. This has been a forensic psychology analysis. The goal was never to sensationalize. It was to equip. Because the only justice that scales is understanding.